Hello, welcome to Photographing the West, episode number 92. If you're new here, welcome. I'm your host, Kirby Flanagan, and I'm a wildlife and nature photographer with a podcast, a newsletter, and a website. If you're not new, welcome back. It's my pleasure to welcome back wildlife photographer Izzy Edwards to talk about her favorite subject, owl photography. Welcome,
Hi,
Izzy.
Kirby. Thanks for having me here again.
My pleasure. So, tell everybody about how you got started with owl photography and how you get those wonderful owl photos.
All right, so basically, first I'm going to talk about the more technical side of how I'm able to photograph owls, which of course is with the camera. Right now I'm using a DSLR. It's the Canon's 7D Mark II, and I'm also using the Sigma 150 to 600 millimeter. It's an f/5.6 lens, and I really love it. I also recently have been able to borrow the older 400 2.8 Canon prime lens, which has helped me quite a bit with some photography. But yeah, that's the technical side to my owl photography. So here is my slideshow, and I'm going to start off with how I got really started with owls. So when I was about 9 or 10 years old, my dad used to take me with his friend Art up to Vancouver, BC, where there's actually a huge variety of owl species densely located close to each other. I think they have like 15 species up there, and I think about 13 of which can be found in the same general area. So when I started going up there, I was a little bit skeptical. I didn't know why we were driving 5 hours to see a few bird species. But when we were able to go there, we were lucky enough to arrive at the exact year the snowy owl eruption of 2012 was happening. So all those young 1-year-old birds of snowy owls came down from the Arctic and really populated pretty much everywhere around the US. Not so much the mid, even actually a little bit, but they came down primarily on the coasts and in these bay areas, and some were even seen down in, like, I think some really south states, but I was lucky enough to see them in Vancouver, BC. And all I knew about them then was, Hedwig from Harry Potter. That's what the snowy owl is. But when we finally crest that hilltop and got to the Bay Area where the snowy owls had been seen, I was just awestruck. These beautiful, stark white birds hanging out basically on the ground on these logs down by the dike. It was just mesmerizing, and it really captured my attention. I'm like, wow, this is a really fabulous bird species. But while we were up there, we didn't see just the snowy owl. We got to see actually quite a few cool bird species of owl, and one being was the saw-whet owl that we were able to see in pretty close proximity to the snowy. Actually, the northern saw-whet owl is only about 5 inches tall, and me, as a younger kid, I was like, oh my goodness, this is the cutest thing I've ever seen. And that also mesmerized me quite a bit when it came to photographing these birds. But at first, I kind of got these field ID shots. This was taken when I was 9 years old, just with the original. My first camera I ever played around with was my dad's, and it's the 40D Canon camera. And so I just took a couple snap ID shots, but I didn't start really getting into owl photography until I had like a newer camera of my own with a different lens. I had my very first long lens, which I borrowed, was my dad's 100 to 400 original Canon lens. And this was one of the very first owls I really tried to photograph and capture all its beauty. This was a long-eared owl that I saw while I was walking the dike by the bay, and I was really just captivated by her beautiful, like, yellow-orange eyes. Were just so stunning, in that plumage with all the different patterns and colors. I was like, wow, this is a bird I want to pursue and I want to photograph in these coming years. So this was taken when I was around 14 years old, first testing out my camera capabilities and trying to capture the essence of the owl. So now that I'm more into owl photography as not so much even a hobby anymore, but I sell prints and I do workshops, and just even for education, and I want to understand them more and be a part of conservation projects with them. But as I got more into it, I got a lot of questions from my friends, family, and other photographers asking, how do you find these birds? I've been around all my years walking the forest near my house. I've been traveling and I haven't seen one. How do you find them? And I'd say my biggest advice to especially people who live here in the West Coast, primarily Washington, Oregon, Vancouver, BC, around those areas, California, Idaho, and Idaho even, my biggest, I guess, help towards finding your first owls would to be focused on these very two species to start out with. So this pictured here is the barred owl, which is a pretty large owl here in the Pacific Northwest. They're one of the most commonly seen birds, and they're actually invasive species, which is not really their fault. Back when we were kind of coming over our westward expansion and planting trees across the Great Plains, it was actually very recently that the barred owls was discovered that actually, migrated over across the Great Plains. Was in the 1970s. They started nesting in Washington, and that was the very first recordings of them, and now they're everywhere. Your backyard, they're in the local forest by your home, local parks, really able to urbanize and adapt to life with people. So finding these birds is probably one of the biggest species that I'd start out with, is to try and find the barred owl, along with the great horned owl, which is another commonly seen species here in the Pacific Northwest, or just the western United States. They are extremely adaptable birds. They can be found living in slot canyons in up to 110 degrees saguaro cactus forests of Arizona, not forests, but saguaro cactus desert land of Arizona, and in 125 degree heat, they thrive and have their babies, but they can also be found in the Arctic, where, negative 40 degree winters. So extremely adaptable birds, and they're one of the more commonly found in your backyard, local parks and forests. Again, this bird is really adapted to living with people in urbanized areas. So how do you find them? Well, a lot of times when we're out walking in the forest, trying to look for the owls, we're really looking, a lot of people try and look for the bird themselves, but we don't consider the other animals that the owl lives around. And one of the best and easiest ways to find a great horned owl or a barred owl would be to listening to the other birds in the forest. So the passerines, the smaller passerines, as in like robins and smaller songbirds, chickadees, even the corvids, which would be the crows and the jays, will make a huge amount of ruckus, and it's called mobbing is the behavior, and they will come down and harass these owls when they find them in their day roosts. And so, this can be just loud jabbering, making sounds, but the owls are predators of these other bird species. So the birds are protecting their territory, they're protecting their babies and nesting habitat to try and scare away the owls. But this happens nearly every single day. When an owl is living its life, all these birds come and mess with them. So one of the easiest ways to find them in your local parks, or even sometimes in your backyard if you have a forested area, is to just listen to the other birds in the forest. And if you hear a large amount of smaller birds going nuts and making a lot of chaos and ruckus, you can follow them, and a huge amount of the time you will end up finding an owl, or sometimes either other hawk species. But mostly owl species get harassed by these birds. So when you are able to follow those birds, then you can return to that same spot you saw the owl, because owls are usually very habitual animals. So if you find them in one perch one day, they'll usually come back to a surrounding perch, and sometimes some individual owls will use the same exact perch on the same tree day after day. But usually they'll be found in the same quarter-mile radius. So if you do find them, that one day walking your dog or just out for a walk, if you return to the same spot, they should be there consecutively most days. So once you are able to find these owls in your local parks, you can really get creative with the scenery around them and just kind of getting those really unique images, especially with these more commonly found birds, because then you have a lot of subjects to work with. Another great way to find these owls, the barred and the great horn specifically, in your local parks, is if you're comfortable walking a little bit before sunset, or even like 30 minutes after sunset. So if you take, you're going out for your neighborhood walk, just listen, and you could hear, especially in springtime, the birds, the owls, making their call as soon as they wake up for the evening hunt. So since the great horned and barred they're pretty nocturnal species, so they'll be out right before sunset, right after sunset, calling. And if you are able, not even if you can find the bird that night, if you return to the same general area where you heard them the previous evening, you have a high chance of finding their day roost. And that's another great way to locate these backyard owl species. So then, again, when you do discover them, this is a great horned owl, just playing with different compositions is one of the biggest ways, I'd say, to get into owl photography. A lot of people really love those flight shots of owls coming in and straight on with their wings out. But I think if you're the way I've always approached it and the way I've looked at it is if you're always obsessing over the flight shot and you have your ISO way high up and you're trying to get that higher shutter speed to capture the bird in flight, you're missing a lot of other opportunities for the birds perching. So I suggest personally that if you're interested in getting into owl photography, starting with those perch shots to try and challenge your artistic compositional values and angles to try and really understand the birds' personalities, their behaviors, and just get some intriguing images from just them perching or even sleeping during the day. Another great benefit to finding these two species in your backyard owl species, the great horned and the barred, is that it's pretty relatively easy to find their young come spring. So if you do follow an individual or even a pair of owls throughout, late winter to early spring, their babies make themselves well known, and the birds will even take you to their nest if they're out hunting and they catch something and return to the nest. You are able to find, their breeding grounds, and you can watch the young grow up from a very young age to fledge and learn how to hunt for themselves. So same with the great horned owls. These babies so great horned owls usually have their babies around March and April. They're very, very vocal. They'll be screaming and hissing, and if you do follow around your local pair of barred owls or great horns, it's definitely a plus to be able to find their young come springtime. So the next question I get from other photographers or other birders is they want to find the more elusive or rarer owl species around the Pacific Northwest. Probably the biggest main goal most owlers or birders really want to see in the owl with the owl species is the great gray owl. Great gray owl is a huge draw for photography. They're so huge and graceful and pretty tolerant of people that they become really beautiful and intriguing subjects. So many people do want to find the great gray. So, including myself, when I was around 15, I really did want to see the great gray owl in all of its entirety. And at first, we really didn't know where to look. And that's usually the question I get. How do you find great gray owls? And, how would you suggest looking for them on your own? So the great gray owl, at first, I didn't have any friends that had been seeing them extremely recently, so I didn't have any information to go on from networking or any individuals that could tell me, 2 days ago I saw one here. So the first step I took in finding a more rare or elusive species like the great gray was some research. So I went online and the first thing I looked up was the range. Like, can I even find a great gray owl in Western Washington? Well, it turns out they're extremely rare here in Western Washington. More so found in Eastern Washington and the Okanagan. But I wasn't quite ready to pursue this bird in Washington because their populations were so low here. So I looked up, where are they most common? And the first things that were coming up were the interior of British Columbia and as well as southern Alberta, just a little bit east of the Rocky Mountains. So I was like, I see these huge populations and these reports of these birds here, and with no real pin or, exact location to go on, I wanted to go on a trip to Alberta and see if I could find them by myself. So the next step I took with my research to try and find the species was trying to figure out what habitat they prefer. So I found out their range. They're found here in southern Alberta, but where exactly? Do they like, near bodies of water? Do they like high boreal forest? Where am I going to find one? So the next information I found on the great gray was they like places above 3,000 feet elevation and down in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. It was about 4,000 to 5,000 feet elevation. And they really like habitats and forests adjacent to open field areas and bogs, a little bit of water source, and a high population of voles and small rodents, which great grays love to eat. So we planned our trip to Alberta, my dad and I, who was really happy to go on this adventure, and I was excited he was able to come with me. And we embarked on our search. And at first it was very daunting. We didn't have an exact location, but we looked in this above, this 4,000, 5,000 feet elevation range and the habitat that the great gray likes, which happens to be near farmers' fields. So these conifer forests that are bordered by these huge meadows or pastures where the farmers have, their horses and livestock free ranged or close to free range. They usually have smaller fences around these properties. And as long as we didn't trespass, because you want to make sure, especially if you're around private property or staying on the main road, or if you do want to go onto private property, you do have to ask the owners. So we mostly stayed on the main roads. And we just drove up and down. And another piece of information I learned from my research was great grays can hunt in the middle of the day, depending on the weather, if it's more lesser visibility, if it's colder out. But usually they'll be hanging out early morning and evening looking for food. So I went looking for them, and as you can see from this picture, they blend in very, very well. They're extremely good with their camouflage, and especially in pine forests or conifer forests, they blend in right so easily to that trunk of the tree. So it definitely was difficult to look for them, especially on the borders of those forests. But the first one we did find was on a fence line near private property, just as we had seen in my research that they like to hang out near these big open meadows / pastures that are bordering the forests. So once we spent a few days looking in the early morning and evening, we did have luck with finding the great gray owl. And that's probably my best advice when it comes to finding these more elusive species, is just research of habitat first, and then the range first, then habitat. What kind of food do they like to eat? What's the elevation? What habitat are they going to be found in? These meadows or these heavy forested areas? And we were lucky with finding them. Here's another picture in winter. You can see behind the bird's perch that there is a fence, and that is another agricultural / livestock area that was bordering a forest. So they were we did end up finding them after using this information we had found online to discover them for ourselves. So here's a couple more pictures of the great gray after we found them. And another example of an elusive animal that this one took me probably the longest to find out of any of the species I've tried to photograph. This is a northern pygmy owl. It's the smallest species of owl in the Pacific Northwest region. They're about 4 to 5 inches tall, adorable little owls, but it took me forever to be able to find them, probably because they're so small. But it all started with that research, again, for the more rare and elusive species, just looking up their range, and they happen to be residing pretty much everywhere where I lived, but I could never find them, and I wasn't hearing them, so I decided to go to BC to look for them. So I went to BC, British Columbia, Canada, and I went up looking where there had been reports of them, and I couldn't find them. I went to Alberta once to visit friends, and I happened to look for them there. Got a couple fleeting glimpses of them, high in the pine trees or, flying away from me, but I never got a good view until I started considering looking practically in my own backyard. I got a message from a friend one day that she had seen a little owl on her hike near our house, about 10 minutes away from where I live, and I had her send me the picture, and I was like, wow, that's a pygmy owl. Why haven't I seen one here? So I did my research for Washington. Pygmies really tend to love elevations above 3,000 in the mountain range. In the wintertime, they'll come down to clear cuts in the foothills of the mountains where it's less cold, less snow, and they'll be hunting. So I took this into consideration, and this winter I went on a couple trips to where I could find these clear-cutty areas where it was at the foothills of the mountain ranges, and there was a lot of public property and private property, and I was able to spend a lot of time looking for them. And I got extremely lucky with finding not only one or two, but I found about, probably 15 individuals just this winter by researching their habitat, and in turn, it really helped my search. So really, that research and understanding each individual owl as a species, because there's some owls in the Pacific Northwest alone, we have 15 species of these birds. Some are only 4 inches tall, like the northern pygmy owl. Some are 2.5 feet tall, like the great gray owl. They all have different ranges. They have different habits. They act differently. Some are nocturnal. The pygmy owl, for instance, is a completely diurnal owl, which means they're hunting and awake during the day, relative to most everybody's assumption of owls of being nocturnal. Well, the great horned and the barn owl and partially the barred owl are very nocturnal species. They'll be hunting at night. But for instance, the great gray owl, which is crepuscular, will be hunting in the evenings and in the mornings, whereas the pygmy is hunting during the day. So really just this base research for understanding each individual as a species and, just their habits and all recordings of data past from other birders and how they found them can really aid your search looking for these more rare or elusive, in the pygmy owl's case, species. So when it comes to the photography side of these owls, I definitely really like these unique compositions. I like sharing images that nobody has ever seen before. So for owls particularly, I love their plumage, and there's so many shapes and patterns, and they have like these feathers that almost look like tiny little hairs, which is really cool. So I try to capture these really different and unique images, and that's how I approach owl photography, is trying to find a composition that is new to everybody in the photography world, something nobody's ever seen. So just focusing on these different compositions. Here's another example of that. The pygmy owl, which again is a 4-inch tall owl, really wanted to have an image that illustrated that, to show how small they really are in their habitat. So here is a pygmy owl sitting on top of a ponderosa pine tree, and really just trying to capture that and capture how small he really is on top of that ponderosa pine. So getting a little bit more of an environmental look at it and trying to practice with these perching shots rather than, getting set up for the flight or the action. I'm always looking for an intriguing, perched and relaxed image. So going along with that idea of capturing the environment or capturing a unique photograph of owls, here is a long-eared owl in eastern Washington in this very snowy range, and I really wanted to be able to share that and capture what environment this little owl was perched in. So I overexposed a bit and created a lighter vignette over in post-processing over this image to just really create the snowy scape, but your eye is immediately drawn to the darker bird who is near the center of the frame. Another example of capturing the environment, instead of just having the close-up trophy shot, just trying to share like the great gray owl. It lives in these high wooded areas at these the bordering of the dense forest. So he's out in the open flying through, and in the background I have that dense conifer forest, which I really think illustrates the habitat of the great gray owl really well, which is a reason why I like this image. Another example of just a perched owl in its environment. This is a great horned owl in a pine forest, and just having that light and the background with how he blends into the bark of the pine trees, and just capturing really how well this owl looks in his habitat. Another example of more of a unique capture of an owl. This is a long-eared owl in beautiful light. And when we first started looking for this long-eared owl, they're extremely beautiful, but very, very elusive and shy owl species. So when we began looking for them, I was with a couple friends, and they have their cars, and I have my car. We don't want to flush them. We don't want to scare them in any way. My goal when I approach owl photography, a success in owl photography is when you leave the owl just kind of relaxed and perched as he was, and any movement or any flight that the owl has while you're in the presence of him, you want it to be natural in their idea. You don't want to spook them or scare them. So we stayed in our car, and we knew that the long-eared owls tend to be quite skittish. So we just slowly rolled, since they are used to the cars next to the road, slowly rolled up and down, looking and scanning these deep brambles. And it was in the middle of the day, this harsh light coming through. And it was very difficult to find the long-eared owl, but I was going slowly, and all of a sudden I locked onto a pair of eyes, and I was like, wow, there he is. And I almost forgot to say, stop, look, there he is. And everyone stops their cars, and we use the cars as a blind, and we start taking pictures of them. And I noticed the harsh light coming through, and people were commenting on it, and this light is super harsh. And so what I did was I took my exposure down as far as I could to try and capture the shadow and darkness. And in post, I cut blacked out a few areas, especially in the top of the image, to create less distractions, just to try and challenge this idea of a trophy owl shot versus a more creative and compelling image. And that's usually, just as I said before, how I approach it. I want people to see, something they've never seen before. And so that's why I really loved this harsh light, which created these really cool patterns and shapes on the owl. A lot of people, really, really love these flight shots. And I have come to love them too, as I've, started to stray away from the perch shots, which I've always started with and I've always photographed as mostly focusing on owls perched in their natural environment. But now I'm just, entranced by these wingspans and the beautiful patterns, as you can see on this burrowing owl, the beautiful patterns and shapes on their plumage. And I'm really fascinated with that. So I wanted to start capturing these owls in motion, which usually means with wings open. So with these smaller species, the burrowing owl, for instance, is about 8 to 10 inches tall, a pretty small owl species, and that means they're going to be a lot faster than, say, the great gray owl, which is 2 to 2.5 feet tall. So since they're going to be a lot faster, I definitely recommend bringing shutter speed quite a ways up. So for this shot in particular, it's probably around 2,000th of a second, which just to try and capture stop the motion in the wings, because they're going really fast. He has a bug he has in his hands and his talons, and I just wanted to be able to stop that motion. So with a higher shutter speed and anticipating these flight shots, definitely try with a lot faster of a shutter speed. But with owls like the great gray owl, some of these bigger species, and even the barred owl, they're a little bit smaller, their wingspans are smaller, so you can get away with a slower shutter speed. I usually try to be around 1,500th of a second for great grays, and I've even gotten away with 800th of a second photographing the great grays, because they are just so slow and forgiving in flight. So it's pretty easy to keep the ISO low and keep your shutter speed reasonable to be able to capture the great gray or the bigger owl species in flight. So an example of that, here's the great gray owl in flight. This was around 1,000th of a shutter speed, and it was able to stop it pretty well, all the motion, and he even has his feet dangling out there. So I really do, as even though I really love these creative compositions of the long-eared owl in the snow, or an environmental shot of a great gray owl flying through his environment, I also do love these nice trophy shots of the owl coming straight on, or having their feet out, or just something interesting of a bird in action or flight. So now when it comes to, we've talked about photographing owls in flight and getting all these beautiful compositions and photographing owls perching. Well, there's a lot of species that they do hang out past dark, and it's hard to get a photograph of them because your shutter speed is low, you're going to have to drive your ISO way up. And I think one of the biggest mistakes in owl photography starting out that beginners make is getting too confident with using flash or flashlights on owls, which is not great. It's not great to get into the habit of using flash on owls, particularly one individual, night after night, because once you do photograph an owl consecutively with flash at night, that's their time to hunt. That is their time to take care of their babies. They're hunting for their family, for their survival, and you will affect them if you're constantly lighting them up with flash during their prime time to be awake. So this photograph was taken of 2 western screech owls, which are they're pretty nocturnal species of owls. They usually come out around 20 to 30 minutes past sunset. So it is very dark. Like when I took this photograph, for example, it was almost pitch black. I couldn't see them at all without looking through my camera. And I had manually focused, and this was taken at around 4 to 5 seconds of an exposure. So definitely taking a lot of time to let that light in. Well, I took about 150 photos. And this one and maybe 5 or 6 others were the only ones that came out sharp because, of course, these owls are going to be moving their head. They're just waking up, so they're going to stretch their wings a bit. They have their feet moving. So it was hard to get 2 owls in the same plane focused right and stop their motion because of that higher exposure or that longer exposure of the 4 to 5 seconds. But it is the more ethical way to catch them. You know, obviously you could shine a flashlight at them and take a picture, but that's not particularly a nice thing to do, especially if this is a spot that you can revisit time after time. So if you are able to find, let's say, a western screech owl cavity like this, and you want to photograph it, even though they are coming out 20 minutes past sunset, get yourself a tripod or a remote control button so you can practice ethically photographing owls with longer exposures instead of blinding them night after night. And that's definitely one thing I want to make clear when it comes to photographing owls, because they are vulnerable, and a lot of them are nocturnal. Another thing is a lot of people, when they want to photograph birds in general or even just owls, they want that straight on flight shot. They really want, the whole wings and everything in focus, and they want it, coming straight at them. And a lot of people get the wrong idea that feeding owls, baiting them, using calls to get them to come closer is the great thing to do, but it's really not. So when you are baiting an owl with mice intentionally for photos, you're changing their behavior for the rest of their lives. So when they see you come in with your mouse and you have your mouse out and you're going to throw it for them, they get used to people coming by, and they're smart birds, and they're going to remember you as the one who feeds. And when they get closer and more habituated to cars and the road, owls like to fly low, and a lot of them get hit by cars. They'll get too habituated. They won't hunt for themselves. So if you do want that flight shot, make sure you're not baiting owls or getting them to come closer to you, and respect their natural behavior, because they will fly and they will give you a chance to take that photo. You might not get it the first time, you might not get it the 100th time, but at least you're interacting with these birds in a safe and ethical way for both you and the owl. So you can learn how to photograph and learn the owl's behavior while you're at it. Definitely the easy way out would be to go to Petco and grab a little white mouse to throw out in the snow or out in the field, but it's not the right thing to do. And you want to make sure that you are treating the animals with respect that you are spending your time with, since they are wild, even though they might not seem like it if they do come close to you without sometimes they will come very close without any warnings. But so yeah, that would be my take on photographing owls, and how I started locating them, and how you can locate them for yourself and start photographing owls for yourself. But yeah, thank you so much. That's the last slide of my presentation.
Okay, that was great, Izzy. Why don't you talk about your workshops in case somebody wants to join you?
Of course. So I have workshops. I don't guide, which is a little bit two very different things. So unfortunately, if you do want to go see certain species of owls, I cannot take you to them. But I do offer workshops in composition and lighting. I can't promise any particular species of animal or bird, but I usually go to local parks around Seattle, and one I've liked recently is Juanita Bay. There's Discovery Park, Lincoln Park, just these local parks where there are guaranteed sightings of wildlife, usually the great blue herons. But I'll teach, composition and lighting, and those are $150 for about 2.5 to 3 hours of work in session and in-person learning. And even if you're brand new to photography, I'm happy to help you learn how to use your settings, ISO, the exposure triangle, all of that. And so those are my workshops. And if you want to contact me, my website is isabeledwardsphoto.com, where you can contact me directly through there.
Okay. And how about if somebody wants to buy some of your prints?
Yeah, same way. So isabeledwardsphoto.com, I have a pricing slide, and I have my gallery filled with all all prints, all my photographs that you can look at. And you can contact me also directly through there. I think I have my phone number and both email on my website.
Okay. Where was this place in BC that you found all the owls?
So in BC, there is an area, it's right west of Vancouver. There's Delta and Richland. I think it's Richmond or Richland are the two major cities where these owls are pretty much everywhere. There's a couple dikes. One is called Boundary Bay, where people often see, I think, over 5 different species of owls there, mostly in the winter. There's different parks. Stanley Park in particular has a lot of great horned owls and barred owls. Sometimes the occasional saw-whet. Rifle Bird Sanctuary has sandhill cranes, different species of owl, and a whole bunch of ducks. And they also offer these little seed packets with they're just a healthy mixture of seeds with they're saltless, and they can give you them for like $1, and you can feed the mallards, and they have a whole bunch of different educational stuff going on there, which is a great park to visit.
As part of your research, do you use eBird?
Sometimes I like eBird, but at the same time, usually a lot of eBird sightings come from people's backyards or main parks. So, if you're looking for a barred owl, all these pins will come up in people's backyards or local parks. So I find it sometimes easier just to go look on my own and not rely off those sightings. Sometimes they're often inaccurate as well, but I have used it in the past a few times.
Okay. Well, you've had wonderful luck with if that's the right word, with the great gray owls, because I've looked for them several times with somebody that was knowledgeable and in the area, and got skunked both times. So
Yeah,
I'm
they can be hard to find and photograph. They're very good at camouflage. So oftentimes they'll be like right in front of you, and they're just completely camouflaged on whatever perch they're on.
right. Well, I did have a good experience up in Ontario many years ago, where I went up with a friend, and there had been a report of a great gray owl, and sure enough,
That's
it was there. And like you say, they're very people tolerant. And at one point, the owl had been flying in a field hunting, and then all of a sudden he came over and sat on a fence post about 5 feet away from me, surprising
yeah.
me at least. So
Yeah,
that
I
was a
think one of the best ways to describe them is they're extremely bold birds, and where a lot of species of owls, especially I've noticed, mostly with barn owls, can be very skittish. And the great grays, often I've seen pictures of them perched on people's tripods, they've landed on people's heads. It's like you're just another object in their environment, which is a great way to view it because, if you can make yourself one with the owl's environment, they will come closer to you and they will become more tolerant if you don't disrupt them in any way.
Do you remember what ISO you were shooting at with those screech owls?
Yeah, so I think I was at 1,250, and I was getting about 4 seconds exposure, and I was manually focusing. I was using live view to see like if it was sharp enough, and I did get quite a few that were a little bit blurry, a little bit off, so I'd have to go in and retouch. And as it got darker and darker, of course, I'd be moving my settings a little bit, to compensate with that. But that one was difficult, but worth it.
Yeah, I would say it was difficult, especially trying to focus in the dark.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So, what software do you like to use to work with your images?
I've mostly been using Lightroom for all of my photographic journey, and I found it pretty useful, but recently I got introduced to the great beast of Photoshop, and it's been hard to go back. Obviously, I'll use Lightroom for the minor adjustments of, exposure and shadow correction, but if I want to, if there's a little bit of a stick in the corner of the frame I want to get out and get rid of, I'll go into Photoshop and kind of pixel peep, and I find it as like a wonderful program to use for pretty much anything, but there's a lot to learn about it, so I'm only like not even 1% there understanding the full program, but I really love those two.
Okay, yeah, to say there's a steep learning curve with Photoshop is not an exaggeration.
Yeah, that's for sure. It is definitely the beast of editing.
Yeah, in many ways. Well, thanks for coming back on the show, Izzy, and sharing your wonderful owl photos and your techniques for getting these great photos. Show notes can be found at www.flanaganphotos.com, spelled FLANAGANFOTOS, along with the audio and video versions of this podcast. We'll be back on October 15th with an episode on backcountry photography with Alan Makowitz. Tune in then, and bye for now.